Hi everyone, welcome to this video. You should be excited about Ionic 4, and in this video I want to show you why, because I am really excited about this release of Ionic, and I want to walk you through why I am excited, what exactly Ionic is, and we'll build a very simple Ionic app so that you get a feeling for what's awesome about it. So what exactly is Ionic? Ionic, previously in its prior versions, was mostly a tool, a framework you could say, that used Angular to allow you to create native mobile apps which you can distribute through the app stores with the help of Angular and web tech technologies. Now, from version 4 on, it's more than that, but one core idea that still is central to Ionic is that you have one code base which you create with web technologies, so with HTML, JavaScript, and CSS to get different kinds of applications. And since Ionic 4, that could be a normal web app or a progressive web app, so basically an enhanced web app, but still an app running in the browser. It could be mobile apps for iOS and Android, which you distribute through the respective app stores, so which are not running on your browser, but which you really install on the devices. Or it could even be a desktop app with the help of Electron, which is a tool that basically takes a web app, wraps it into a desktop app, and then runs it as a desktop app. And that is pretty cool. And the awesome thing about Ionic, you can use one and the same code base to build an application which you can then distribute across different channels, which can save you a lot of time. Now, Ionic is not just a set of tools that helps you build different kinds of apps, though. Actually, in its core, Ionic, if we really look just at that name, Ionic is a suite of web components. And web components basically are custom HTML elements. By the way, I got a full course on Udemy on how you create web components with the help of Stencil and also without it, where Stencil is another tool created by the company behind Ionic, which is also called Ionic, and which this company also used to create these Ionic web components. I guess that's a lot of Ionics in there, right? But Ionic, so this package which you basically can install from NPM, so which you can add to your project, which you can import there, that is a set of pre-built web components, of custom HTML elements built by the team behind Ionic. And why would you add these elements? What do they do? Well, these are elements like buttons, tabs, modals, alerts, labels, list items, a full grid. Essentially, they allow you to change what you see. They allow you to build a beautiful user interface with HTML and these custom HTML elements. And that's exactly what we'll do later in this video. Now, Ionic is not just this package, though. As I mentioned, there is a company which essentially is named Ionic, which is developing this Ionic web component package, which developed this tool named Stencil, which spits out these web components, which you don't have to learn to use Ionic, by the way. And this company behind the Ionic web component package also worked on a tool named Capacitor. Now, if you know Cordova, Capacitor is basically the same, just in a more modern and easier to use version. If you don't know Cordova, Capacitor is a tool, is a package you can add to your Ionic project. It's 100% optional, and it allows you to convert your web-only app to a native app as well. And it does so by giving you a native app shell, which mounts the web app into a web view of that mobile app. And this allows you to take your Ionic web app and distribute it through the app stores and really install it on mobile devices. And this is this sharing of that one code base I mentioned earlier. So this is another amazing part of the Ionic world, you could say. You don't just have this set of amazing web components that allow you to create beautiful applications. You also now have a way of turning that application into a native mobile app. Now, you were able to do that in the past too, and you will learn why it's now easier and more fun and more flexible than ever to do this with Ionic 4 or higher. Now, to finish this slide, though, Ionic is also not just this package of web components and capacitor, it also is the Ionic CLI, command line interface. This is a tool you use to create and manage your Ionic projects. Behind the scenes, it actually works together with, for example, the Angular CLI when you're using Angular to build the web app, but it also works together with Vue or Create React app. So essentially, it's like an extra layer in your build workflow that makes adding capacitor or building your mobile app especially simple. So this gives us productivity. It speeds up the development flow and so on. Last but not least, the Ionic platform also is about certain cloud and premium services. Not all cloud services are premium there, not all have to be paid. And these would be, for example, an extra service that allows you to build your mobile app in the cloud, which, as a big advantage, enables Windows users to still build mobile iOS apps, which normally would not be possible because Apple does not allow that. Well, with a cloud build, which runs in a cloud macOS environment, you suddenly can do that. But that's not really what I want to focus on here. Instead, let's create a tiny application and see why using Ionic is fun and why Ionic 4 is more flexible than ever before. So I did open an empty folder here in Visual Studio Code, and you can use any editor you want. And in there, I'll create a new index.html file because I want to build a very simple web application. Now, thanks to Visual Studio Code here, I can easily add a HTML5 skeleton, which I'll name First Ionic App, or whatever name you want to add. And the very cool thing about Ionic 4, which you will quickly see as a big advantage if you used with prior versions of Ionic, is that now you're not limited to just Angular anymore. Now, don't get me wrong, Angular is an amazing web framework. It makes it really simple to build powerful applications driven by JavaScript, and I love Angular. But not everyone loves Angular, or not everyone knows Angular, or not everyone uses Angular. And Ionic 4, now can be used with any framework. It can be used with Vue, you can use it with React, or even without any framework or library at all. You can use it with vanilla JavaScript. And that's just what we'll do here to prove how this works. If you go to ionicframework.com and you go to installation here under developers, you find different ways of installing it with the CLI, the account here, or with Creator. None of that is what I want. But if you go to UI components here, and at the moment at least this is how to get there, and then guide, you will actually find this packages and CDN link here on the left. And that's the nice thing. You can still build an Angular, an Ionic app, or React, or an Ionic, and whatever you like, with a more complex build workflow that bundles your files and compiles them. Basically what you do in Angular and React and Vue projects. But if you just want to get started, or you have a simple web application, you can grab this CDN link here, which basically allows you to include the Ionic package into your project, and just add it here in the head section. Now, you'll actually also need a second CDN link, which unfortunately isn't mentioned on the official docs right now, to get some styling. And for this here, you need to replace dist with CSS, and then import ionic.bundle.css here. Now, with that added, we're importing Ionic into this project. And inside of your body here, you can now start using these Ionic web components. And now here again, if you dive into the official docs and now on components, you see all these components Ionic 4 offers you. Now, previously in older versions of Ionic, you also used components, but these were always Angular components because Ionic in the past only worked with Angular, didn't work with Vue or React. Now these are web components, which is a browser specification that basically controls how you can build custom HTML elements with HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. And again, I got a full course on that if you want to learn all about that. Now, this is nice. Here, we have all these web components we can use. And for example, we can add an ion-app component, which you always should have as a wrapper around your entire Ionic app. And there you can add an ion header component to have a nice header in your application. Here you can add an ion toolbar, and these are all components you find in the official docs, with an ion title, like my first app. Now, below the header here, we can add Ion content to mark the area where we want to render our main content for this given page. And in there, let's say we want to allow the user to enter some text. We could add an Ion input element, which we set to type text, just as we can do it on a normal HTML input. This is supported by this web component here. And where I also want to add my own label, an Ion label, where I have, let's say, first name, and where I can now add a position of floating. Now, how do I know that you can do that? Well, in the official docs here. If you would search for the input item there, here it is, you'll learn about all the properties you can set there to control how this component will behave. Because the idea behind these web components is that you have HTML elements which are not baked into the browser, which have a default styling and all kinds of different behaviors. Because it's not just some visual thing, it's not just HTML with a little bit of CSS on it. These web components are actually built with JavaScript, and therefore they can include all kinds of powerful logic. And here, this Ion label, for example, has the logic to give us a text which will actually float up if we click into the input. Now, to make this work, it turns out we also need to wrap this with an Ion item. So we want to add Ion item here as an element and move the label and the input in there. And if we now save that, we simply open that with a double click onto that file. Then we got this first Ionic app here. Now, the styles are missing here because obviously this import here should be a link with a rel attribute of style sheet, and source should be ref. Because I'm not importing a script here, this is instead, of course, a style sheet. So after converting this script thing to a link, if we reload this page, now we get a much nicer styling, and here our clickable input. Let me zoom in a bit. Now, the most amazing thing about Ionic, though, is if you now open your developer tools, and there, in Chrome at least, you use this toggle device toolbar button. You can preview this app as it will look like on a mobile app. Now, this is of course just a simulation, not a real mobile app emulator, but still, you can see how it would look like on Android. And if you switch to an iPhone and reload, how it would look like on an iOS device. Difference might be small for this app here, but you can already tell there is a difference by the positioning of the title. Now, it's super easy to adjust this to your needs. Not only do you have complex theming options with CSS variables and a lot of advanced stuff, which I will cover in my Ionic course on Udemy, which I'll be updating to Ionic 4. No, you can also do some simple adjustments. Like here, on the Ion toolbar, it takes a color attribute, which you can set to primary, for example. And we'll get a default primary color, which colors it blue, just like this. And if you now decide to add a button that should look like a button as it looks like on Android or on iOS, you can throw in an Ion button element, like add my name as a caption, give this a color of, let's say, primary as well, and a fill attribute of outline. There also is a default mode, of course, if you don't add this, but let's add outline here. If you do all of that, this is what we get. Now, obviously, positioning could be improved a little bit here. So let's just throw the padding attribute like this without a value on Ion content. And the default styling that ships with Ionic actually now gives us a little padding around that overall content container. We can also give this button a little margin here if we want to, by simply adding margin or margin vertical. And again, these are all things you find in the official docs. You don't need to learn that by heart. So if I do that, now we have some distance between the button and this input. Now that's all nice, obviously. And I will go for margin in all directions by adjusting it like this. How can we now interact with that? How can we add our logic? Well, nothing easier than that. We can just throw in an app.js file or any JavaScript file you want and import that here at the end of our body. So script source will be app.js. Let's close the script tags. And in here, we can now get access to our custom HTML elements, to these web components, as you can get access to built-in HTML elements. So if we want to get access to that button, we can do this, for example, with document query selector ion button. We could have also added a CSS class or an ID to the button. And now we can add an event listener here, where we listen to the click event and then execute some code when this click occurs. Now let's say we want to read that value that was entered into the input. Well, for that we just need to get access to the input with document query selector ion input. And here in our button click listener, we can now get the entered value with input value, which is a property that will exist because input is a HTML input element. And now we could check if entered value, if we trim it, has a length that is smaller or equal to 0, which means we basically didn't enter anything there. Or if it somehow isn't set, so if it is not truish. And if that should be the case, we can return to not do anything with the value. Otherwise, we can reset the input value by setting it back to an empty string. But before we do so, we might want to output this text somewhere. And that, again, could be simply a paragraph, because we can also use normal HTML elements in here. And in that paragraph, we want to output our, value. So let's simply get access there. Output could be, or output paragraph could be document, query, selector. And again, you could use a CSS class for selecting, could use IDs. I'm using the tag selector. And then I can just use output paragraph and set my text content equal to the entered value. With all that added, if we reload this application and I enter max here my name is. And if I now switch back to a pixel here, remember how that button looks like? And I reload. Here we got that Android style. And that is the awesome thing about Ionic, or one of its awesome advantages. We get platform-specific styling out of the box. We just add these web components. And this is not even a native app. This is a web app, but a web app that looks like a native mobile app. And that offers a lot of possibilities to us. And of course, you can adjust the styling here. You can override this with CSS if you want to. But having this as a default, as a smart default, is amazing and can really speed up your development flow. And you could take this web app and package it up in a native app with Capacitor or with Cordova and then ship that to mobile devices. And of course, I also cover this in my Ionic course. So here is the same functionality on Android. Now, this is in a brief, very brief example of what you can do with Ionic. Now, there's so much more you can do. You got way more components. If you check out the guide, you can do way more with Ionic in general. And please keep in mind, this year, and that is the cool thing about Ionic 4, does not use Angular. It also doesn't use React or Vue. It uses vanilla JavaScript. And this extra flexibility of being able to use Ionic with whichever tool you want to use it is amazing too, because it gives you all the freedom and allows you to tap into the powerful advantages and features offered by Ionic in any app you might be building. So if we have a look at the history of Ionic and its future, we'll see that Ionic 1 was released in 2013 and it was all about Angular 1. It used Angular 1 to give you as a developer the possibility of using pre-built Angular 1 components back then, because web components weren't a thing in 2013. Browsers didn't support that specification. So you used Angular components offered by the Ionic team to have native device-like looking controls, which was one thing. And you primarily also used Ionic to, get real native apps distributed through the app stores. Building web apps with it was not the primary focus. And it was limited to Angular. Now, the same was true for Ionic 2, which was released in 2016. You also used that to build Angular applications with Ionic and to basically build mobile apps with Angular and Ionic. And Ionic 2 was basically the same as Ionic 1, just for Angular 2, which of course is very different to Angular 1. It also only worked with Angular because Ionic was just giving you pre-built Angular components. Now, Ionic 3 is the same. It was just a small update to Ionic 2, still worked with Angular, a little bit more focus on getting web-only applications, but in its core, Ionic was a set of pre-built Angular components. Now, fast forward, and the Ionic team basically was at the point where it had to decide if it wanted to stick to Angular only or support other frameworks and libraries as well. Because not everyone uses Angular, not everyone likes it. And therefore they decided to move away from Angular and instead use a specification, a technology offered by modern browsers, web components. Ionic 4, which was released in 2019, embraced web components, and all the Ionic components are now just web components. That means they don't depend on Angular at all. You can use Ionic 4 and higher versions of Ionic with any framework or no framework at all. You're not tied to Angular. You can use it with Angular, and there still is a strong built-in support, but you can also use it with React, Vue, or just dump it into a vanilla JavaScript project. Now, to look into the future of Ionic, there will be new major versions of Ionic every 6 months, but major does not mean everything changes every 6 months. It just means there will be Ionic 5 in 6 months, then Ionic 6 in 6 months, and so on. And the idea there is that you have small, incremental, backward compatible changes over time, just as it is the case with Angular nowadays. So we probably have a bright future, we have an exciting past, and we now have an Ionic that we can use anywhere. And that is why I'm excited about Ionic 4, why I like working with it, because it's so easy to get started, so easy to build cross-platform apps and share them everywhere. And having these pre-built, nicely styled, highly flexible components which are still adjustable is just an amazing tool and a lot of power in our hands.